When the U.S. Army introduced the M18 Hellcat in 1944, the battlefield witnessed something entirely new. Unlike the steel giants that dominated the war with thick armor and raw firepower, the Hellcat embodied a radically different philosophy. It was the very essence of American tank destroyer doctrine: speed, agility, and precision firepower, all fused into a single unorthodox machine. Capable of racing at over 50 miles per hour, the Hellcat was more than just fast. It was the fastest armored fighting vehicle of the entire Second World War. Soldiers who rode inside remembered the sensation vividly. The engine roaring at their backs, the hull trembling as it surged across muddy French roads, the world blurring past through the open turret. That speed was not luxury, it was survival. It meant the Hellcat could appear suddenly on a flank, unleash a deadly shot, and vanish before German gunners had time to react. Its 76mm high-velocity gun was lethal against German Panthers, able to pierce even the formidable Panther. But the trade-off was severe. The Hellcat's armor was so thin that crews often joked it felt like tin foil. A direct hit, even from a medium German tank, could turn it into a burning wreck in seconds. The men who fought in them knew the grim truth. The only protection they had was movement, cunning, and the ability to strike first. To those crews, the M18 was not simply a vehicle. It was a predator, light, quick, and merciless when handled with skill. They called it a Hellcat for a reason. Its very design demanded boldness, demanded that the men inside gamble their lives on speed and surprise. And at Arracourt, in the misty fields of Lorraine in September 1944, that gamble would be tested against Germany's best. There, as waves of Panthers and Panzer IV rolled forward in a desperate counterattack, the Hellcats would prove that mobility and sudden shock could be every bit as deadly as armor and brute strength. What unfolded was not just another clash of steel, but one of the most dramatic demonstrations of American doctrine and courage on the Western Front. By September 1944, the Allies were no longer crawling through the hedgerows of Normandy. They were surging eastward in a furious wave. The breakout from Normandy had torn open the German front, and General George S. Patton's Third Army was driving deep into France, stretching supply lines almost to the breaking point, but threatening to punch straight into Germany itself. The rolling countryside of Lorraine, dotted with quiet villages and low ridges, suddenly became the hinge point of this advance. Near the small town of Arracourt, American forces paused to regroup, catch their breath, and prepare for the next push across the German border. But for Hitler and his high command, that pause looked like an opportunity. The German army in the west was battered, reeling from months of retreat. Morale was fraying, equipment losses were mounting, and their once dominant armored forces had been bled white in Normandy. Yet the Reich desperately needed a symbolic victory, something to stall the Allied advance, to prove to its own soldiers and people that the Wehrmacht could still strike back with lethal force. To achieve this, Hitler turned to one of his last remaining trump cards: the newly formed 5th Panzer Army. With fresh reinforcements, including scores of Panzer IVs and the formidable Panthers, it was ordered into action. The mission was ambitious, even reckless: smash through the American lines in Lorraine, cripple Patton's armor, and reclaim the initiative on the Western Front. For the men of the U.S. 4th Armored Division, this meant that their tank destroyer battalions, equipped with the fastest killer on the battlefield, the M18 Hellcat, were about to face their greatest test. They were not just up against a German counterattack. They were standing against a numerically superior armored force, seasoned crews inside some of the most feared tanks of the war. And yet, in the fields around Arracourt, the Hellcats would carve their place into history. Against all odds, They would help write one of the most dramatic chapters in tank warfare on the Western Front. A story of speed against strength, of fragile hunters against steel predators. On September 18, 1944, the storm finally broke. 17 tanks from the German 111th Panzer Brigade, supported by Panzer Grenadiers, surged north toward the town of Lunéville. The town was already contested ground. Elements of the U.S. 42nd Cavalry Squadron and Combat Command A, CCA, of the 4th Armored Division were holding parts of it against fierce pressure from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. The German assault hit like a hammer. American defenders were forced back into the northern sector of Lunéville, fighting street by street, building by building. Company B of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, positioned on the high ground northwest of town, was called into the fight. Its 3rd platoon of M10 tank destroyers rolled forward under heavy artillery fire, engines straining, crews bracing themselves as shells burst around them. From their elevated positions, the M10s made the most of their advantage. Their gunners used the high ground to spot enemy movement, waiting for the moment when German armor exposed its flanks. By nightfall, 3 German Panthers lay wrecked, their hulks smoldering on the outskirts of town. Reinforcements soon rushed forward. 2nd Lieutenant Richard Buss and his platoon of M10s advanced alongside the 37th Armored Regiment. Near a railway embankment, Buss spotted 2 concealed Panthers lying in wait. He directed his men into position, turning the ambush back on its hunters. With calm precision, the Americans fired. Repeated hits slammed into the 1st Panther until it erupted in flames. The 2nd tank disappeared into the fog of battle, likely destroyed or abandoned by its crew. The platoon lost only 1 man that day, a sniper's bullet the sole American casualty in the skirmish. Elsewhere, another advancing Panzer was destroyed by the 3rd platoon. The German push had been repelled, though the cost was not without tragedy. The following day, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Bailey, the respected commander of the 704th, was killed by mortar fire in Lunéville's narrow streets. More reinforcements poured into the contested town. Company C of the 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion entered Lunéville on the 18th, followed closely by the 773rd. German probes on the 21st and 22nd tried again to break through from the north and east, but each time they were beaten back. Lunéville remained firmly in American hands. Yet this was only the beginning. While the fighting raged at Lunéville, the rest of CCA and Company C of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion were digging in near Arracourt, about 12 miles to the north. There, the newly formed German 113th Panzer Brigade was gathering its strength, preparing to strike. Just after midnight on September 19th, an American outpost near the village of Lizy caught the distant rumble of heavy engines. The sound was unmistakable. German armor was on the move. The outpost wasted no time, calling down an artillery strike that blanketed the night in thunder, temporarily halting the advance. For a moment, the darkness fell silent again, but everyone knew it was only a pause. The Germans were still coming. At dawn, a thick fog smothered the Lorraine countryside. Visibility was reduced to mere yards, turning fields into a gray, shifting void where friend and foe could stumble into each other at point-blank range. Around 7:30 a.m., Captain William Dwight, leading a small force, stumbled upon the tail end of a German tank column moving along a country road. By sheer luck, he was not spotted. Dwight slipped away and radioed the warning back to his commander, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. Half an hour later, 2 Shermans south of Lizy blundered straight into the head of the same column. Out of the mist loomed the dark silhouette of a Panther, barely 75 yards away. so close that the crews could see the dew on its armor plates. Reacting instantly, the American tanks opened fire. The fog that cloaked the Germans now turned against them, robbing their long guns of range. Within moments, 3 Panthers were knocked out. The rest slipped back into the mist, shadows vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. Captain Dwight returned to CCA's command post at Arracourt, where he was given urgent orders. He was to take a platoon of M18 Hellcats to reinforce the defenses at Leasy. Company C's commander, Captain Thomas Evans, selected 3rd Platoon under Lieutenant Edwin Leeper for the mission. Engines roared to life as the Hellcats rolled out, their open-top turrets exposed to the foggy morning air. Moving northeast of Arracourt, the platoon soon spotted ghostly shapes moving through the haze. German armor creeping forward like predators in the mist. It was the opening act of a brutal clash that would define Arracourt. The Hellcats quickly took up hull-down positions in a shallow depression. The fog was so thick that gunners could not even rely on their telescopic sights. They fought by instinct and experience. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Patton later recalled the tactic that saved them. Simple but deadly. A Hellcat would edge up just enough for its gun to clear cover. Fire a ranging shot of high explosive to adjust aim. Then follow with armor-piercing rounds designed to shred through German steel. But every muzzle flash was a double-edged sword. Each burst of fire gave away a position, allowing German gunners to zero in. 3 Hellcats were lost in the first exchanges. One fell in a particularly tragic fashion. As it pulled up from cover, its engine stalled, leaving it stranded in full view. Another Hellcat rushed forward to tow it to safety, only to be bracketed by precise German fire. One shell landed so close it nearly traveled straight down the recovery vehicle's barrel. Moments later, the immobilized Hellcat was hit and destroyed, a plume of fire marking its grave. Yet even in the fog and chaos, the Hellcats proved their worth. Speed and flexibility kept them alive where armor could not. The duel had begun, and though losses mounted, the Americans were determined to hold the line. The clash around Arracourt quickly descended into a savage brawl. In the fog, there was no long-range maneuvering, no grand tactics. It was tank against tank at knife-fighting distance, where reflexes, nerves, and luck determined survival. Corporal Frederick Stewart, serving as gunner in Sergeant Emilos Stacy's Hellcat, locked onto a pair of Panthers advancing through the mist. With rapid, practiced precision, Stewart fired 2 shots in quick succession. Both German tanks erupted in smoke and flame, their hulks barely visible in the gray morning air. But victory came at a brutal price. German return fire slammed into their Hellcat, tearing through the thin armor. The blast wrecked the turret. Stacy and Stewart were both wounded in the legs. Another crewman was badly injured, and one was killed instantly. Their Hellcat lay silent, a crippled predator. Elsewhere on the line, Corporal John Eidenschink, manning the gun in Sergeant Pat Ferraro's Hellcat, scored 3 kills against advancing Panthers in less than an hour. His fire was devastatingly accurate, carving holes in the German attack. But no Hellcat could remain invisible for long. The enemy's shells found their mark, smashing into Ferraro's vehicle and forcing the crew to scatter under fire. Sergeant Steve Krusky's crew pressed forward with a fury born of desperation. They destroyed 4 Panthers in relentless succession, their gunner reloading and firing as if possessed. But such defiance drew deadly attention. German fire finally caught them, knocking out their Hellcat and leaving several crewmen wounded among the wreckage. Of the platoon that had gone into action, only Sergeant Edwin McGurk's Hellcat remained intact. His gunner, Corporal Dominic Sarantino, fought like a man possessed. Calm under pressure, he methodically aimed and fired. knocking out 2 more Panthers before the battlefield fell eerily quiet. The fog still clung to the fields, but through its veil, smoldering wrecks littered the ground. For hours, the fight raged in close quarters. The mist that shielded the Germans from American aircraft also stripped them of their greatest advantage: the long-range killing power of their 75mm high-velocity guns. Instead of sniping from a distance, Panthers were forced into duels where their thicker armor mattered less, and the Hellcats' speed and cunning mattered more. Recognizing the danger, Captain Evans pulled together what remained of his 2 battered platoons. Alongside Company C of the 24th Engineers, he positioned them on the high ground south of Arracourt. It was no longer just about hunting German armor. Now, the Hellcats and Engineers formed a thin, determined wall. The last shield protecting CCA's command post and its critical artillery batteries. The men understood what was at stake. If the line broke, the German 113th Panzer Brigade could drive straight into the heart of the American position, scattering command and silencing the artillery that anchored the defense. Every Hellcat crew knew they were fighting not just for survival, but to hold the front together. By midday on September 19th, the Germans regrouped. The fog that had cloaked the battlefield all morning finally began to lift, revealing the rolling fields and ridgelines south of Arracourt. What emerged from the thinning haze was a sight Captain Thomas Evans and his men would never forget. 30 to 40 Panzers advancing steadily toward their thin defensive line. Evans watched carefully from his position, nerves taut as the enemy closed in. He later recalled the moment with stark clarity. "We waited and waited until they were within 1,500 yards. Then we fired. The 2 lead Panthers lurched to a halt, struck dead on by armor-piercing shells. Flames gushed from their hatches as black smoke coiled skyward. Confusion rippled through the German formation. For reasons still unclear, perhaps shock, perhaps poor coordination, the following tanks began to turn sideways, exposing their vulnerable flanks. That mistake was catastrophic. The Americans, hidden in carefully prepared hull defilade positions, seized the opportunity with ruthless precision. From cover, the Hellcats revealed only their turrets, each crew working like clockwork. Fire. Reload. Shift position. Fire again. Their open-top turrets allowed for quick spotting and communication, making their response even faster. German gunners tried desperately to adjust, but the Americans never stayed still. Each time a muzzle flash betrayed their position, the Hellcats darted to a new depression or ridge line, denying the enemy a target. What followed was nothing short of a slaughter. 11 more German tanks were destroyed in rapid succession, each hit hammering the 113th Panzer Brigade's resolve. Within minutes, what had begun as a determined armored thrust dissolved into chaos. Survivors faltered, momentum broken, and soon the entire brigade began to pull back. The official after-action report credited Company C with 8 Panther kills in that engagement alone. Among them was an astonishing feat. Private Frank Amico, on his very first day as a gunner, accounted for 5 Panther kills by himself. For a young soldier thrust into the crucible of battle, it was an achievement as remarkable as it was grim. That evening, as the battlefield quieted and the acrid smell of burning armor lingered in the air, General George S. Patton himself arrived at Evans's command post on the hillside. Below them, the valley was littered with smoldering German wrecks. Colonel Bruce Clark, commander of CCA, pointed to Captain Evans as the man responsible for directing the defense. Patton, never one for lengthy speeches, kept it simple. He looked out at the field of shattered Panthers and declared, "This is the kind of thing that's going to end the war quicker than anybody had hoped." Then, without ceremony, he turned, walked back to his jeep, and drove away. His words, though brief, stayed with Evans's men for the rest of their lives. They had held the line, and in doing so, turned the battlefield south of Arracourt into a graveyard of German armor. At dawn on September 21st, the battlefield once again disappeared under a blanket of heavy fog. The silence was deceptive. Believing that the Germans had finally pulled back after 2 days of bitter fighting, CCA began to shift its formations. Around 9 a.m., 2 American columns moved northeast, advancing cautiously but with growing confidence. For a brief moment, it seemed the front might remain quiet. Then the trap was sprung. Half an hour later, dark shapes loomed from the mist. The 113th Panzer Brigade had not retreated. It had been waiting. German tanks and infantry struck suddenly at the rear of the American columns, threatening to cut them off from their supply lines and artillery. The gray fields erupted once more in the thunder of battle. Reacting with speed, both American columns wheeled about to meet the attack head-on. At Arracourt itself, a company of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion went into action, working in close coordination with M4 Shermans and the ever-reliable American artillery. In the maelstrom that followed, 6 more German tanks were destroyed, their blackened hulks left smoldering among the hedgerows. By midday, reinforcements surged forward. The 691st and 602nd Tank Destroyer Battalions, along with the 320th Regimental Combat Team of the 35th Infantry Division, established a strong defensive perimeter around Arracourt. The battle hardened into a grinding clash of armor and infantry. The 37th Armored Regiment lost 7 Shermans that day, each one a burning scar on the battlefield. But the exchange was lopsided. No fewer than 18 German tanks were knocked out in return. The following day, September 22nd, brought scattered but no less deadly fighting. American forces swept the fog-choked fields, encountering German probes at irregular intervals. Near WWII, the 25th Cavalry Squadron came under sudden assault. 5 light tanks were knocked out in quick succession as the Germans pressed forward. Nearby, Lieutenant Marvin Evans's 2nd Platoon of Company endured a harrowing ordeal of misplaced friendly fire, American artillery shells falling dangerously close to their own positions. When the cavalry began pulling back, Evans ordered one of his M18s to cover the retreat. From a mere 600 yards, the lone Hellcat opened fire with cold precision. 3 German tanks were destroyed in quick succession, buying the time needed for the withdrawal. The Hellcat then fell back, leapfrogging with the rest of the platoon in a textbook fighting retreat. By nightfall, the tally was staggering. In the days since the fighting began, CCA and the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed 79 German Panthers. In exchange, their own losses were painful but comparatively light. 14 Shermans, 7 M5 light tanks, and just a single M18 Hellcat permanently written off. But the battle was not finished. The Germans were not willing to concede defeat so easily. On September 23rd, the 111th Panzer Brigade launched yet another combined tank and infantry assault from the east, determined to break the American grip on Arracourt once and for all. The fields of Lorraine would see even more fire and fury before the outcome was decided. On September 23rd, the Germans struck again. The 111th Panzer Brigade, desperate and determined, launched a full-scale assault from the east. Tanks and infantry advanced together, their treads grinding through the wet soil, their silhouettes emerging from the fog like predators closing in for the kill. For the Americans, it was yet another test of endurance in a battle that refused to end. But this time, the defenders were ready. From high ground northeast of WWII, American tanks and tank destroyers waited in concealed positions. As the first Panthers crested the rise, their steel hull shining in the morning light, U.S. gunners opened fire. The range was perfect, the angle devastating. One after another, German tanks were struck, burning fiercely as black smoke drifted across the sky. Overhead, American fighter bombers screamed down, strafing and bombing German infantry columns attempting to push into the village of Monsel. The assault faltered under the combined weight of firepower from every direction. In the thick of the fighting, Captain Thomas Evans once again proved himself a leader of rare grit and determination. His courage under fire would soon earn him the Silver Star. He later described one harrowing moment that captured the chaos of Arracourt in its purest form. The Germans had launched yet another push toward the town. Two of Evans's M18s were hit almost immediately. One erupted in flames, a column of smoke marking its death. Another had its track blown off, immobilized but with its guns still functional. Evans, furious and unwilling to yield, leapt into the crippled Hellcat. For a brief, furious span of minutes, he personally loaded and fired the weapon, knocking out two more Panthers before the Germans zeroed in. Realizing the danger, he crawled out of the disabled vehicle just before it was engulfed in flames. His gamble had paid off in kills, but nearly cost him his life. All along the line, the fight was bitter and personal. Men fought with everything they had, each Hellcat darting in and out of cover, each Sherman holding its ground, each infantryman digging deeper as the tide of steel pressed forward. But by late September, the momentum had shifted. The German attacks, once fierce and determined, grew ragged and disorganized. Panthers advanced in smaller groups, their coordination shattered. Panzers that had once been feared now burned across the fields of Lorraine, their hulks testimony to what relentless American resolve and the Hellcats' speed and firepower could achieve. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The German brigades, committed in haste and with little training, were being chewed apart. What Hitler had envisioned as a decisive counteroffensive had become a bloody failure. The battlefield around Arracourt was littered with wreckage, the ground itself scarred by fire and steel. For the men of the 4th Armored Division and their tank destroyer battalions, the cost was heavy, but the victory was absolute. Arracourt had become more than just another clash. It was the graveyard of the Panzer brigades. By the final days of September 1944, the fury of Arracourt had burned itself out. What began as a bold German counteroffensive, intended to smash Patton's Third Army in Lorraine and restore the initiative on the Western Front, had ended in disaster for the Wehrmacht. In just over a week of relentless fighting, the U.S. 4th Armored Division and its attached tank destroyer battalions had shattered the newly formed Panzer brigades. Nearly 285 German tanks and assault guns were destroyed. Against this staggering loss, American armor losses were fewer than 35 vehicles, including Shermans, light tanks, and M18 Hellcats. The exchange was devastating, a ratio that told the story more powerfully than any communique. The Panzer brigades had been rushed into battle with little time to train and even less coordination. Their strength was squandered piecemeal, thrown against prepared defenses and mobile American tactics that made full use of artillery, infantry, and air support. The result was not only the destruction of precious German tanks, but the crippling of formations that the Reich could no longer afford to rebuild. For the Germans, Arracourt was more than a lost battle. It was an irrecoverable blow. The armored forces that had once struck fear across Europe were now shadows of their former selves. Hitler's gamble in Lorraine had backfired catastrophically, costing him the last reserves of armor needed to mount a sustained defense in the West. For the Americans, the victory was a vindication of doctrine and design. The Hellcats had proven their worth not through brute strength, but through speed, cunning, and coordination. Their 76mm guns had been deadly at the typical engagement ranges of Lorraine. Their open-top turrets, once considered a liability, gave crews unparalleled visibility to spot targets first and react faster than their opponents. And when paired with artillery barrages, infantry screens, and the screaming dives of fighter bombers overhead, the Hellcats became part of a deadly symphony of combined arms warfare. Arracourt became a textbook case, studied long after the war as an example of how agility and integration could overcome heavier armor. More importantly, it marked the last large-scale German armored counteroffensive on the Western Front before the Ardennes. In the rolling, fog-drenched fields of Lorraine, the myth of German invincibility in tank warfare was broken once and for all. The battlefield was quiet again by October. Smoke drifted lazily from the blackened carcasses of Panthers and Panzer IV. The fields that had echoed with the roar of engines and the thunder of shells were now littered with wrecks, a steel graveyard stretching to the horizon. For the men who had fought there, the victory was clear, but the memory was seared into them. The sight, the sound, the cost. The M18 Hellcat had shown exactly what it was meant to be. Fast, deadly, decisive. Against the might of Germany's best tanks, it had not merely survived, it had triumphed. The Battle of Arracourt was more than a clash of steel in the fog of Lorraine. It became a turning point, a lesson carved into history about what mattered most in armored warfare. Germany had committed some of its best machines, the feared Panthers with their thick sloped armor and long 75mm guns. On paper, they should have dominated, but in the fields around Arracourt, those advantages were undone by speed, cunning, and teamwork. The M18 Hellcat emerged from the battle not as an invulnerable giant, but as a weapon that proved the genius of its design philosophy. It was never meant to go toe-to-toe in a slugging match. It was meant to outthink, outmaneuver, and outshoot. Its powerful 76mm gun was more than enough when the crews used the terrain, the fog, and their speed to strike from flanks. Its open turret, so often criticized, gave those crews the vision to spot first and fire first. More importantly, Arracourt revealed the strength of American combined arms. The Hellcats did not fight alone. They were part of a greater whole, working with Shermans, infantry, engineers, artillery, and fighter bombers in a seamless partnership that magnified their strengths and covered their weaknesses. This was American doctrine at its sharpest edge. And at Arracourt, it shattered the myth of German armored invincibility. For the Germans, the cost was irreparable. Their newly formed panzer brigades, rushed into battle without proper cohesion, were mauled beyond recognition. Tanks could be rebuilt, but the loss of trained crews, the blow to morale, and the sheer scale of destruction left scars that could not be healed. Arracourt marked the end of large-scale German armored offensives on the Western Front. What Hitler had hoped would be a thunderous counterstrike instead became a graveyard of ambition. For the men who fought in the Hellcats, the battle was both triumph and torment. They had seen comrades fall, had watched friends wounded and machines burn. Yet they had also seen their light, fast, and fragile vehicles achieve the impossible, standing toe-to-toe with Panthers and emerging victorious. Their courage, quick thinking, and sacrifice transformed the Hellcat from an experimental idea into a battlefield legend. In the months that followed, as the Allies pressed toward the Rhine and beyond, the echoes of Arracourt lingered. Soldiers who had been there carried with them the memory of fog-shrouded duels, of the sudden flash of muzzle fire, of the eerie silence that followed victory. Historians would study it, generals would cite it, and generations of tank crews would remember it. The legacy of Arracourt was clear. War is not always won by the heaviest armor or the biggest gun. Sometimes, it is won by the faster mind, the sharper reflex, and the willingness to gamble everything on speed and surprise. In that regard, the Hellcat had lived up to its name: swift, deadly, and decisive. On the rolling fields of Lorraine, where wrecks still rust beneath the soil, the story of the Hellcat remains etched in history. It was proof that even the most feared machines could be brought low by men who refused to yield, who trusted in their speed, and who fought with the conviction that victory could be forged not by brute force, but by daring.